There's 2 weeks to go in the legislative session, and there's a whole lot of issues that seem to be a long way away from passage. We're talking budget, data centers, AI, and maybe a little bears on this episode of Capital Cast. I'm Jerry Nowicki, Editor-in-Chief with Capital News Illinois, talking with Ben Szalinski and Brenden Moore, along with our public affairs reporting contributors Jenna Schweikert and Nikoel Hytrek. Ben, I'm going to start with you on our favorite topic, the state budget. We learned this week that the budget picture got a little bit tighter. What's the latest on the governor's and the legislature's revenue estimates?
This week, both analysts in both offices reduced their revenue estimates for the upcoming fiscal year 27 budget lawmakers will pass within the next few weeks. Really, the biggest takeaway from that is it really just underscores how tight the budget situation is for the state. These reductions were not substantial by any means. It was less than 1% of the budget, upwards of $100 million or so. But, really, I think it just kind of shows that the state is kind of flattening out on revenue here in the coming fiscal year, and I think that's kind of the takeaway that lawmakers are going to have from this, because you have, a group of progressives who say the state really needs to start enacting some new revenue policies to raise revenue as it stagnates here. There's another school of thought to hold on to your tools and kind of, wait until those revenue policies are needed. So that's kind of, the early implications of this, but it gives lawmakers a much clearer roadmap of what direction they have to go with this budget over the next 2 weeks.
Right. There's a term in the State House it's called April surprise, where sometimes the April revenue report, when taxes are filed, it comes in, there's way more money than you expect or far less, but ultimately here it's sort of what we were expected, but the reason for the downward revision was sort of just the economy, concerns about that, or what else were they talking about?
Yeah, it was very economic focused. Inflation is obviously increasing more substantially than I think anybody had expected when the governor first introduced his budget just 2 weeks before the war in Iran began. So that's really had a big impact, I think, on the outlook of the economy overall. The S&P Global report that lawmakers have kind of leaned on for these analyses has a lower GDP growth than was originally expected earlier this year for 2027 and 2026. So, I think that's kind of also playing a role here, is that economic growth is not going to be very high. At the same time, we're seeing unemployment continue to rise here, at least in Illinois. Topped 5% in February for the first time in quite a while, went up to 5.1% in March. That can certainly ultimately hurt income tax revenues. What the analysts told us is that, as unemployment rises, people lose their jobs, there's less income tax revenue to come with. But inflation, in some ways, could even help the state budget because wages have increased over the last number of years. But with inflation continuing, it really comes down to when consumers decide to cut back from the high prices.
So it's not really unusual to see a budget develop late, right? We're always here May 31st. Usually it's in the last 24, 48 hours that we see the full details and they come to agreement. So that's kind of part of the process. But we're here 2 weeks left in the legislative session, and it seems like everything is sort of in that limbo period, maybe even more so than in previous years. We got a lot of big issues coming up. So I'm going to turn to Nikoel to talk about one of them, and that's data centers. She's been following data centers and the Power Act this year. Nikoel, do you want to tell us a little bit about what the Power Act does, how it would regulate data centers, and what some of the holdups might be?
Yeah, so the Power Act is this big data center regulation bill that would address concerns about energy prices and the amount of energy that data centers require to run. It would also require some water reporting so people know how much water these facilities are using. And it would require data center companies to enter community benefits agreements, which would help to bring community members who are in the neighborhoods where these centers will be built, bring them to the table, talk a little bit about issues that they care about and have protections more for the regular people. And those are kind of the big concerns people tend to have.
I think one of the interesting things for me is we've been following this is it seems to have some level of bipartisan support. I know you spoke to Representative Jed Davis, who's on the fence about the Power Act, but in general is looking at regulation. So what did you hear from advocates, for this bill about where it stands right now and why it seems to be just sort of standing still?
Nobody can really say why it's standing still because there is so much support seemingly for this package of regulations. Republicans and Democrats both have talked about their constituents' concerns as these projects are brought forward, as they begin to operate in these communities. So advocates are really just looking for some answers about what the status is and where people are coming from.
Right, and I found it interesting. There was a little bit of harsh words, or at least light criticism, harsh as they come in a Democrat-controlled state like Illinois, but for the governor. Katie McFadden, she's the lead lobbyist for the Clean Jobs Coalition, which has been pretty powerful in energy negotiations, renewable energy stuff over the years. She said she was, quote, concerned and confused by the governor's lack of engagement on data center issues in the spring legislative session. So, the governor does say he wants some level of regulation. He wants data centers to pay their fair share, is a term he's used. He's called on the electric grid operator to sort of make more requirements for data center energy. So he hasn't been silent, but I think the broader point here is just that he's not leading the negotiations, or at least not as engaged as some of the advocates would like. So what's next for that? Are we just continuing subject matter hearings, or are we kind of just in wait and see approach?
I think that is one of the questions a lot of people have. One of the sticking points here is there are certain requirements, like for data centers to bring their own energy generation and for that generation to come from renewables. There are people who aren't quite on board with the renewable energy part. That's a lot of the Republican opposition to this. There are some concerns too about whether so many rules might lead data center companies to not come to Illinois, which would then mean some places in Illinois are going to miss out on potentially tens of millions of dollars in property taxes. So there are some sticking points still, and I think that that's why we're seeing people just continuing to talk about it.
In the past, and this is another one of those things, energy policy especially is one of those things that just always seems to come together late in the session. It ends up, you're in the final days and you hear, oh, there's an amendment filed to the bill, and now we're talking about getting these regulations passed. So that could happen here, where it's just kind of wait and see mode at this point. But in a somewhat related topic to data centers, we've been following AI regulation, and this week, the Senate Democrats unveiled 8 bills that would regulate AI in some capacity. One of them was more wide-ranging than the others. I'm going to bring in Jenna Schweikert to talk about the Senate package and what it is that the main bill does and some of the other bills.
Yeah, so this package is covering kind of a lot of ground, but on some pretty specific issues. We have 2 bills that are tackling chatbots. One is focusing on how social, emotional, companion kind of chatbots would respond to mental health crises from users. And then the other would require customer service chatbots just to disclose to consumers that they're chatting with a machine. Then we have 2 that regulate AI in schools. One bans facial recognition technology, and then the other one would restrict teachers from using AI to grade assignments. Then we have 3 that look at consumer protections. One bans people from using bots to mass purchase event tickets and then resell them. Another prohibits landlords from using AI software to collude on rental prices. And then the last one of consumer protections just requires companies to give consumers the chance to opt out of data collection, which has been kind of a big issue after some companies had data leaks. But really, the major bill in this package tackles frontier AI, and it would establish some requirements around transparency frameworks, third-party auditing, and critical safety risks where these models could, teach people how to develop a weapon that could injure or result in the death of people. And notably, OpenAI and Anthropic do support this bill, and that's what this bill is, the kind of developers that this bill is aimed at is large companies. And it's also modeled after some similar laws in California and New York, which lawmakers said they did on purpose because these are three large states with some major AI markets.
Brenden, I'm going to turn it to you a little bit. You've done, for a couple weeks, you've been doing interviews on just how Illinois is a kind of another domino to fall in state regulation. What is there to know about sort of this blue state effort to pass state regulations and the lack of federal taking control?
Yeah, so the large AI companies, if they had their choice, would have a uniform federal approach. They would have Congress enact a law, have it signed by the president, and have it just be uniform across the country. Well, so far, the Congress has been very slow to act. The Trump administration has been very laissez-faire on AI regulation. So we've seen some of these bigger blue states kind of fill in the gaps. We saw it first in California and then in New York. And Illinois would kind of be that third domino. So the goal here is they want it to be, if there is going to be state level regulation, try to make it as uniform as possible, so there isn't this patchwork of state laws that they have to comply with. That said, Illinois' law would be a little bit tougher in the sense that there is that third-party auditing provision in there that would be stronger than what passed in California and in New York. Although it's not necessarily the strongest bill that's been proposed in Illinois. The Senate package is kind of the product of negotiations. Over in the House, there is a version that went a little bit further that actually Anthropic did support. But as Jenna mentioned, they were also supportive of the bill that's part of the package in the Senate, as is OpenAI. So we're kind of seeing some of the big industry players kind of come around on this package, although it remains a question if there will be enough support. Well, it has to pass the Senate. It hasn't been voted on yet. But if it does pass the Senate, assuming that they take some votes on this perhaps next week, will there be enough support in the House? Are there some changes that have to be made, amendments? What's kind of the back and forth? Because as has kind of been a theme this session, the House and the Senate have not necessarily been on the same page.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that undergirds a lot of these discussions we're having, that it's a lot of advocates behind some of these issues have been frustrated that the two chambers don't seem to be talking, or at least not talking enough and regularly enough, or even in Springfield together enough to hash out some of the details on these things. But it did strike me, I think, in Jenna's story, I believe the Frontier bill it passed committee unanimously, right?
Yes.
big one, and then I think it was 6 of the 8 AI related bills passed committee unanimously, which is a good precursor to um, what's going to happen on the floor. So, do you have any further insight on the sort of break between House and Senate? Is there a break between House and Senate, or are we just sort of like the other bills at this point where we're wait and see how they react one to another?
I think it is kind of wait and see. I think a big issue here generally, because I agree with you in the sense that most of these bills have pretty wide bipartisan support. We'll probably see that on the floor next week. And the same is probably true on the House side. The problem has been that they haven't really communicated very much. So they both kind of had separate siloed processes where they kind of, had their separate subject matter hearings. They had separate kind of negotiations with industry. And so they kind of just have to get on the same page. But I do think there is a general consensus that something has to be done on AI. As Senator Mary Edley Allen said earlier this week, it's kind of the wild, wild west right now in terms of AI. This technology has become kind of omnipresent in our lives almost overnight. I mean, hundreds of millions of people use these chatbots, especially, and I think a lot of legislators, both on the House side and on the Senate side. I also talked to Representative Jennifer Gahn-Gershowitz, who is leading the AI working group in the House among House Democrats. And they recognize that how fast this industry is growing and expanding, and how few, almost no guardrails exist right now. And so they don't want to leave this spring in a couple of weeks without doing something. That said, they again have to get on the same page in terms of having language that both sides can agree on and can get the governor's signature.
All right. The theme today here has sort of been unfinished business. We got 2 weeks to go. It's not insurmountable late start for some of these things. We could still get them done as a legislature. So we'll see how that happens. But speaking of unfinished business, what's going on with the Chicago Bears? I'm going to call in Ben and Brenden here. I'll start with Ben. But the TLDR is that I didn't hear anything about the Bears this week at all. Have you?
Well, the only thing I heard was the Bears are going to play on Christmas and Thanksgiving. So I think that was the big Bears update this week. I didn't see the Illinois Senate on that schedule. So I think really that kind of leads us to the point of, one of the things I think folks have feared in this whole thing is this becomes a May 31st issue and it gets rushed and it gets messier than it maybe already is. Obviously, I think by having nothing move forward this week, I think we've pretty much reached that point. Maybe the Senate will take this up next week or something like that. But, from here on out, it's up against the clock. It's a big deadline issue. And, I think that's kind of got some folks nervous. Obviously, it was not the governor's preferred path. I don't think it was the Bears or the NFL's preferred path, but senators want to get this right, I think, is their goal here.
And, we haven't seen the Bears committing to Indiana, certainly at this point. So, Brenden, what have you heard on that, if anything?
Yeah, not a whole lot this week. I know all the big stakeholders in the House, Senate, Bears, governor's office met on Monday. I'm sure they met a couple other times this week, or at least touch base. This is all happening behind the scenes right now. They're, as Ben said, they're trying to get this right. They're trying to find language that can get the requisite votes in the House, Senate, and get the governor's signature. And probably most importantly, something the Bears would find acceptable. I think a key conundrum here is the desire to provide property tax relief while also making sure that the economic development tool is attractive to the bears and other developers, they're kind of in conflict with one another. And some analysis came out a few weeks ago that showed that some of the property tax relief in the House bill really wouldn't amount to a whole lot. But I'm generally hearing, though, from people that they think this is going to get done. It's just a matter of what the fine details look like, and whether or not there is any property tax relief in this package. That, I've heard some version of perhaps they just strip it down and do some very a strict mega projects, Bears version, or maybe the Christmas tree expands. Again, they're still trying to figure out what gets the votes, but again, a lot of times it just takes time. Eventually, you wear down legislators. It becomes inevitable. They suck it up. They vote for it. I'm hearing kind of more of that when talking to legislators and other people that are around this issue.
Yeah, as we noted a few weeks back, that the original bill went from 37 pages to 370. So if it gets any bigger, we'll have a pretty massive piece of legislation, another one to add to the May 31st list. So that's going to do it for this episode of Capital Cast, the regular podcast of Capital News Illinois. Give us a like on YouTube, subscribe, listen to us wherever you get your podcasts, and thank you for listening.